All right, so we are going to dive right into chapter 4 here, which is the tissue level of organization. And this kind of is like the first new chapter of A&P. We did skip chapter 3, which is the cellular level of organization. I mean, that's mostly review from Bio 1. So we're going to dive right in here. So there are 4 types of tissue. There's epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And epithelial tissue covers exposed surfaces like your skin, but also internal passageways, like your esophagus, intestines. Connective tissue is just kind of fills in all these internal spaces, and it provides padding and just support, things like that. Muscle tissue, of course, is what contracts and allows you to walk and stand and sit and move your limbs. Within muscle tissue is also cardiac tissue. You have smooth muscle also. There's 3 types of muscle tissue: smooth, skeletal, and cardiac. And then we have nervous tissue. All right. So these are 4 broad categories, which you can see here. And we're going to dive right into epithelial tissue. So this is on that surface of the skin. All right. They also line internal surfaces of glands, like sweat glands, for example. The function of epithelia are they provide physical protection, again, like your skin. They control permeability. So it's like, you jump in some water and your skin's going to prevent the water from entering your body. Provides sensation and produces secretions. So speaking of that water, they do have these tight junctions, and they also, and that prevents things from going through the skin barrier. And they have a polarity, and they are avascular, meaning they don't have blood vessels. So epithelial cells do not have blood vessels. So they get what they need via diffusion or absorption. All right. And they also regenerate very quickly, like your cheek, for example, or your mouth, areas of like high, traffic and friction. They need to be replaced quickly. All right. So yeah, we've kind of seen this before. If you took bio, you have the ciliated epithelium, which we have here on the right. And polarity means there's like a functional difference between what's on either end. So you have the cilia in the microvilli here on what's called the apical surface. And then on the kind of the basement level, or the like the inside level, you have the basal surface. Okay. And these are all the different types here. We have simple, meaning one layer, and you have stratified, which means multiple layer. And you have squamous, which are a little more flat, cuboidal, which are shaped like cubes, and then columnar, which are tall like columns. All right. Tight junctions prevent solutes from passing through cells. All right. So let's talk simple epithelia. They are thin and fragile. An example here would be our body cavities, right? The pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal. And they're also characteristic of where absorption occurs, which makes sense because there's one layer, not a lot to go through, easy for absorption. All right. So you will find those in intestine, surfaces of the lungs. And like I mentioned before, then you have those stratified multiple layers, which you'll find in these stressful areas like the mouth. All right. Just a quick reminder of the body cavities here. Pericardial is heart, peritoneal is in the abdominopelvic cavity, and pleural is in the lungs. All right. So again, there are 2 flavors here: single layer for absorption, or multiple layer for stress and abuse. All right. So the first one here, squamous epithelia, which squamous just means flat. Again, so simple squamous epithelial, so single layer flat. We're going to find those in your lungs, in body cavities, in blood vessels. All right. They're going to have a special name depending on what they touch. If they line a body cavity, they're called the mesothelium. And if it lines something that touches blood, like the blood vessels or the heart chambers, it's called endothelium, kind of on like the inside. All right. So the multiple layer, the stratified version, those come in kind of different flavors. They can be keratinized or non-keratinized. The non-keratinized stratified are found in the oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, anus, vagina. Those are those stressful areas that need layers. All right. We have this cuboidal epithelia. So cuboidal are the more boxes or cubes. Simple single layer are found in glands and portions of our kidneys, and those stratified multiple layers, just piles of boxes. Those are pretty rare, but they are found in the ducts of our sweat glands. You also have transitional epithelia that can change. You'll find those in the bladder, where when it's empty, the epithelia are cuboidal, and when it's full, it becomes squamous. They flatten. It allows for urine to fill up the bladder. Makes sense. Last one here is columnar epithelial. So these are taller and more slender, and the hallmark here is that their nuclei are elongated. You can see that, these long nuclei here, and you're going to find these where absorption or secretion takes place. So you'll find these in the small intestine or the stomach with the single layer. You also have these pseudostratified columnar epithelia, and they're going to have cilia, and they're going to be found in the nasal cavity, the trachea, and the bronchi, so all that respiratory system there. And another rare one here, the stratified columnar epithelia, so multiple levels here. They can be found in parts of the pharynx and the epiglottis. All right. So we do have glands, which is a really big part here. And there's two types. We have endocrine glands, which release their secretions into the blood or the interstitial fluid. And we'll learn a lot about the endocrine system and the hormones that they secrete later on. Then you also have what you don't hear as much about. You have exocrine glands, and they release their secretions directly onto an epithelial, so like an outside surface, or into passageways called ducts. So you can think of that like, again, like sweat glands or like tears, for example. All right. All right. Exocrine glands. All right. So here we go. These are like enzymes that are entering the digestive tract. So not necessarily going, in this case, onto the skin, but coming like from the inside of the body into the pipes of our body, into our digestive system. So you can think of the EX of exocrine as an exit, because they're escaping into onto a surface. They secrete mucin, which mixes with water to form a sticky lubricant called mucus. There are actually three methods of secretion. We have merocrine, we have apocrine, and we have holocrine. And these are cool because it takes us back to when we learned about, cell eating and drinking, exocytosis and pinocytosis and things like that. Apocrine secretions, there's actually some cytoplasm that's secreted also. That's with milk from the mammary glands. That first one, merocrine, where it's just the product is released, that's sweat and saliva. Then we have holocrine secretions. Now, these are cool because the entire gland cell is actually destroyed, and a superficial cell, there's actually a bursting that's happening here, and it kills the cell in the process. All right. I actually don't have an example of that here. All right. So now we're going to talk about connective tissue. So just going back to our macro level here, we talked about epithelial tissue. Now we're going to talk about that connective tissue, which fills internal spaces, provides support, and stores energy. And this connects that epithelium to the rest of the body. Believe it or not, bone and blood are types of connective tissue, right? Bone, fat, and blood. Connective tissue can be characterized by these very specialized cells, extracellular protein fibers, and a fluid known as ground substance. All right. Those last two, those extracellular, which I'll call EC fibers, and the ground substance make up the matrix. So we've heard in the past this ECM, this extracellular matrix, all right? And we know that that surrounds all cells. So unlike those epithelia, connective tissue are never exposed to the outside environment, which makes sense. That's the job of the epithelia, all right? A lot of that connective tissue is very highly vascular. Like we said before, epithelia do not have a blood supply. And although they're not on the surface, connective tissue has those sensory receptors to detect things like pain or pressure, all right? So more functions of connective tissue: structural framework for the body and protecting organs, like your ribs protecting your lungs and your heart, for example. Those would be the job of the bones. Transporting fluids and dissolved materials, that's the job of the blood. Supporting surrounding and interconnecting types of tissue, storing energy, especially in the form of triglycerides, that would be a function of fat, and defending the body from microorganisms. All right, there are three general categories based on physical properties here, all right? So we have connective tissue proper, and those that are in a syrupy ground substance, they can be loose or dense. Examples here would be adipose tissue, which would be loose, and tendons, which connect, I believe, muscle to bones, and that would be dense. Fluid connective tissue, these are cells in more of a watery matrix, so not syrupy. Examples of those are blood and lymph. And then we have supporting connective tissue, which is cartilage and bone, right? All right, so we're going to talk about connective tissue proper, which includes that loose connective tissue, which fills internal spaces, and those dense connective tissues that contribute to the internal framework of the body, all right? Now, there are a lot of types, and this picture actually, it kind of comes up a lot in a lot of chapters in this textbook and in A&P. So there's a lot of examples, and we're just going to dive right in. So we have fibroblasts. These are the only cells that are always present in the connective tissue proper. They secrete something called hyaluronan, Jesus, which is a sugar derivative, and proteins. They basically form large extracellular fibers. You can think of FB as fiber builders. That's similar to when we talk about bones, we're going to learn about osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and osteoblasts are bone builders. So fibroblasts are fiber builders. And there's three types of those fibers, which we'll learn about, and that's collagen, which you may have heard about, reticular, and elastic. So then we have the fibrocytes, so like the brother of the fibroblasts. These are spindle-shaped, and they maintain the tissue fibers that the blasts set up. And let's see if we can get a larger picture here on the left. So we can see those fibroblasts here. And let's see if we can find a fibrocyte. Yeah, so a little bit more spindle-shaped right here. So they maintain the tissue fibers that the blast set up. So BC, you could say build. The B comes first, and then C is, I don't know, maintain. Adipose sites or adipose sites, those are fat cells, and they look like class rings. You can see that here, this big yellow cell here. We have these mesenchymal cells. And these are cool because they're actually stem cells that respond to local injury or infection by dividing to produce daughter cells that differentiate into either fibroblasts or macrophages or some other type of connective tissue cell. So they're kind of like a little factory that builds what you need. So if you need to build more connective tissue because maybe there was some damage, these mesenchymal cells, stem cells, will be able to make more fibroblasts so you can build. All right. And you can see that these are these blue ones here. Melanocytes, these synthesize and store melanin, which is a brown pigment, and gives tissue its darker color. Very cool. These macrophages, macro large phage is eat. These are big eaters, and they engulf either damaged cells or pathogens. They release that bat signal, which we call cytokines, which call in backup for the inflammation response, like to a splinter. They can be fixed like a soldier in a bunker on the front line that can reinforce, or they can be reinforcements by the arrival of free macrophages and other specialized cells. Those are very cool. All right. Then you have these mast cells. These circulate in the blood in an immature form. So a mast, like the mast of a ship, has a lot of history. It's full of cells called histamines. All right. Now we're also talking about heparin, which is an anticoagulant that enhances blood flow during inflammation. So an anticoagulant, it's like heparin's a blood thinner. You want loose blood and wide blood vessels for that inflammation response. All right. That's why you get swelling with allergies and stuff, and you would take an antihistamine. All right. Histamine is a signal for blood vessels to widen. So again, this is all in connective tissue proper. All of this is going on there. We have lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cells, and they migrate through the body and develop into plasma cells, which, yes, produce antibodies, which are those proteins involved in defending the body against disease. All right. And yeah, examples of lymphocytes are those B and T cells. And this is all in connective tissue. Wild, wild stuff. All right. Then we also have macrophages, another type of white blood cell. And examples of those are neutrophils and eosinophils. Neutrophils are also involved in that inflammation response. These are also cell eaters and attracted to the site of infection or injury. All right. So connective tissue fibers, we're still talking about connective tissue proper. So remember how we were talking about that those fibroblasts build fibers. They form collagen fiber, reticular fiber, and elastic fiber. Where were we talking about that? Oh, up here, those extracellular fibers. So we're going to talk more about that. So collagen fibers, these are the most common. They are long, straight, and unbranched. So you can see them. They look like little like worms or like, I don't know, like metal rods. They're like strands of a rope. So they're flexible, but get this, they are stronger, straight up. They're straight up stronger than steel when pulled from either end. So you can think about, you know, they like your finger can bend easily, but pulling, this might be a bad example. It's hard to separate in that way. So tendons, which connect muscle to bone, consist almost entirely of collagen fiber. So you can think, you know, muscles are very flexible, but when you pull, stronger than steel. Pretty crazy. All right. Tendons and ligaments can withstand tremendous force, which is why during trauma, bones are more likely to break. All right. Then you have reticular fibers. These stabilize the positions of blood vessels, nerves, and other structures. It's like a mesh network called a stroma. This stops your insides from moving around when you change positions. And they also resist gravity. Elastic fibers contain the protein elastin. After being stretched, they return to the original position, like when you pull on your skin and it goes back to normal. That's the elastin fibers of connective tissue underneath that epithelial surface. All right. We're going to talk about that ground substance again. It fills the spaces between cells and surrounds connective tissue fibers. It's viscous, it's syrupy, because it has proteoglycans and glycoproteins. This viscosity slows down pathogens because it's like swimming through molasses. All right. Glycoproteins are examples, are a combination of sugar and proteins. All right, so then we have these two types of connective tissue proper, loose and dense. So loose connective tissue is a packing material and it fills up spaces between organs. It acts as a cushion, it stabilizes cells, it supports epithelia. So mesenchyme, now mesen, think again of those stem cells, like we were talking about these mesenchymal cells. They're embryonic connective tissue, and it's the first connective tissue that appears in a developing embryo. It gives rise to all other connective tissue. We also have areolar tissue, which is like a padding and elastic tissue. When you pinch your skin, you're not going to affect the underlying muscle because of this areolar padding, all right? Also, as the muscle bulges, the areolar tissue stretches. It has an extensive blood supply and is a common injection site for drugs. All right. Adipose tissue, again, provides padding, but also shock absorption, and it acts as an insulator to slow heat loss. It's found in your love handle area, your buttocks, and your breasts. All right. Now we'll talk about the dense connective tissue and the fascia. So we have dense regular and dense irregular. This tissue is also commonly called collagenous tissue because collagen is the dominant type of fiber here. Examples of dense regular connective tissue are tendons and ligaments, and those are also found in the dermis. All right, elastic tissue is also dense connective tissue and is found between vertebrae and in blood vessel walls. So a lot going on there. So it's these collagen fibers, these connective tissue fibers that are found in this subtype of connective tissue proper, dense connective tissue. So a lot of like layers here. The last thing about connective tissue proper is called fascia. And this is a connective tissue that wraps around and supports all of our organs. And there are three layers here: the superficial, the deep, and the subserous. So the superficial fascia is the subcutaneous layer of our skin. So not the surface of our skin, that's epithelia, but it's actually the third, epidermis, dermis, it's a third level of our skin, all right? Then there's the deep fascia, and this is actually what the ribs are embedded in. Pretty cool. You can actually see that on the right here. These are ribs. That are embedded in this deep fascia. You have the superficial fascia. So that's pretty cool. So blood and lymph are fluid connective tissues that transport cells and dissolve materials. So we just talked about connective tissue proper. Now we're going to talk about fluid connective tissue. So extracellular fibers and ground substance make up the matrix of connective tissue. In blood, the matrix is called plasma. The plasma itself contains those blood vessels, red and white, as well as fragments of cells called platelets. Altogether, these are called formed elements. We'll learn more about this in the blood chapter. And the extracellular fluid has three subdivisions, and this is pretty important. So we have interstitial fluid, which surrounds cells, and in the body, you have 11 liters of this, right? Then you have plasma, which is 5 to 6 liters, and that includes red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and then you have lymph. So we have more interstitial fluid in our body than blood. Pretty crazy. All right, formed elements, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, and combined with that, the plasma, the more watery fluid part of our blood, that's what makes up the blood matrix, I think. Erythrocytes, those red blood cells actually have no nucleus. Then we have lymph, which forms as interstitial fluid enters lymphatic vessels. As fluid passes along the lymphatic vessels, cells of the immune system monitor its composition and then can respond to signs of injury or infection. So that's pretty cool. And ultimately, the lymphatic vessels return that lymph to large veins near the heart. Very cool. So now we're going to talk about the last type of connective tissue, which is supporting connective tissue, which is cartilage and bone. Cartilage, the matrix of cartilage, comes from something called chondroitin sulfates, which are polysaccharides, so sugar derivatives. Cartilage cells are called chondrocytes, and so chondra and cartilage is important. And the only cells here, the only type of cells here, thank God, cartilage is avascular and heals poorly. And there's something called a perichondrium that separates cartilage from surrounding tissues. There are three major types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage, we have elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. All right, hyaline is the most common. It's tough and flexible because its matrix contains closely packed collagen fibers. And don't forget that collagen is one of three types of connective tissue fiber. The other ones are elastic and reticular. It's the most common. It's long, straight, unbranched, like a steel rope. It's flexible but stronger than steel when pulled from either end. All right. Tendons, which connect muscle to bone, consist almost entirely of that collagen fiber. Hyaline cartilage connects the ribs and the sternum, the nasal cartilage, and supporting cartilage in the respiratory tract. All right. We also have what's called articular cartilage, which covers the surface of many joints like the elbow and the knee. Articular, articulate, it moves, makes sense. Elastic cartilage, that's like the external flap of our outer ear. It's like the epiglottis. That covers our trachea when we're swallowing food. Then we have fibrocartilage, which is very durable and tough because, guess again, it also has collagen. And these lie between the spinal vertebrae, and they are the inner vertebral discs. All right. And they also are around our tendons and around joints. They resist compression, absorb shocks, and prevent damage. All right. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. All right. So again, hyaline, elastic, fibrocartilage. So bone, which is also known as osseous. I really need to learn how to pronounce a lot of this stuff. Osseous or osseous tissue. There's not a lot of ground substance in bone, which is like more of a fluid, which makes sense. About 2/3 of the matrix is calcified, meaning it has calcium salts. The rest is dominated by collagen fibers. And when we hear collagen, we think stronger than steel. In its overall properties, bone can compete with the best steel reinforced concrete. Steel reinforced concrete. In essence, the collagen fibers in bone act like the steel reinforcing rods, and the mineralized matrix acts like the concrete. Crazy. Now, bone cells are called osteocytes, which are the most abundant cells in bone. Lacunae are just small chambers. All right. And then you have canaliculi. They're important because diffusion cannot take place through the hard matrix of bone. So yeah, very tight, some tight junctions here. Nothing's going through this. The osteocytes can communicate with blood vessels. And this is crazy and something I never realized. There are these hollow chambers within our bones where there's blood vessels in our bones. All right. They run through these slender passageways called the canaliculi. Also have the periosteum with a fibrous and a cellular level that covers bone. That's composed of fibrous and cellular layers, and it helps attach bone to surrounding tissues, ligaments, and tendons. Almost like a rubberized sort of coating that those tendons and ligaments can connect to. And bones, yeah, can actually grow like a muscle, thicker and stronger with exercise, and they can become thin and brittle with inactivity. So keep that in mind. All right. All right. So just to recap here and go for more of a macro level, we just talked about that was connective tissue. All right. So that was connective tissue, which, remember, there are three types: connective, fluid, and supporting. All right. And that's the second of 4 types of tissues. All right. So just subsection after subsection here. So we're talking about kind of just barriers here, and we have mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membranes, and synovial membranes. So mucous membranes or mucosa line passageways and chambers that open to the exterior, like our digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive systems. The serous membranes, which are the ones we talked about in chapter 1, and they line those sealed internal cavities that are not open to the exterior, and they minimize friction. So like when we jump around, our organs aren't causing friction against, those cavities, all right? The parietal lines the cavity, and the visceral or serosa lines the organs. So visceral lines those vital organs, all right? And we have cutaneous membranes. They cover the surface of the body, and they're keratinized, stratified, multiple layers, and squamous, which means they're flat. So think thick, waterproof, and dry. Then we have synovial membranes, which we'll learn more about in the joint chapter. They're filled with synovial fluid, which are produced by synovial membranes. Synovial fluid provides the lubrication for the ends of bones to prevent friction. All right, so now we're going to get into the third of 4 types of tissue, and that's muscle tissue. We have 3 types here. We have skeletal, we have cardiac, and we have smooth. I'm not really going to go more into detail here because we will get more into detail in the muscle chapter, but just know that skeletal muscle tissue, they're long, cylindrical. They have what's called striations, and they have multiple nucleuses. All right, and that's, again, what's going to move our skeletal system, our limbs, and help us stand and run and lie down and everything like that. Cardiac muscle tissue, they're short, branched, and striated. Usually they have a single nucleus, and they're interconnected. They all kind of contract as one by these intercalated discs. And then last, we have smooth muscle tissue, which are found in like blood vessels in our digestive system. They're going to move things, and they're going to be able to control their diameter and dilate and contract. The last type of tissue here, finally, is called nervous tissue. All right. It's specialized for something called propagation, which is the movement of electrical impulses via ions and electrons. And 98% of this tissue is found in the brain and the spinal cord, with only that other 2% found in that peripheral nervous system. All right. 2 types of nervous cells. You have the neurons and the supporting neuroglia, which supports and repairs that nervous tissue and supplies nutrients. All right. Neurons are very, very long, and they can be as long as a meter. Their cells cannot divide normally, so repair of nervous tissue is limited. Extending from the cell body itself, we have these branching dendrites and one long boy axon, which sends that information, and then the dendrites on the receiving cell will receive it. All right. Axons are also called nerve fibers. And here is a picture here. So that's it. We'll learn a lot more about nervous tissue later on. So the response to injury of this tissue involves 2 things: the inflammation and regeneration. All right. So just a little recap here. So remember that simple epithelia. So, single layer cells on the surface. The most simple is simple squamous epithelia, 1 layer flat. And this is what's found in the lungs, alveoli, specifically cavities, and blood vessels. So this is a special name depending on what it touches. If it lines a body cavity, it's called a mesothelium. And if it lines something that touches blood, like the blood vessels or the heart chambers, it's called the endothelium. Okay. So enter the inflammatory response, which is a process that isolates an injured area while damaged cells, tissue components, and any dangerous microorganisms are cleaned up. Remember, we were talking about those macrophages and those histamines. There's also cytokines that are involved here. After that inflammation subsides and everything rushes and they work and they do all this stuff, something called regeneration comes in, and that's simply a repair process that restores normal function. All right. So what can cause an inflammatory response? We have impact, we have abrasion, we have distortion, irritation by chemicals, infection by pathogens, and extreme temperature, like burns, for example, or like ice, dry ice or something. Each of these kills, damages, or injures tissue in some way, and these changes change the chemical composition of the interstitial fluid. And again, the interstitial fluid, which surrounds cells, makes up 11 liters in the body. All right. So damaged cells release something called prostaglandins, also proteins, and also potassium ions. Potassium, interesting. Damaged connective tissue activates something called mast cells. And I think of the mast of a ship, which has history. It releases chemicals, histamines, that stimulate the inflammatory response. Necrosis is the intentional tissue destruction that takes place after cells have been damaged, all right? Lysosomal enzymes cause the damage. Autolysis, lysis means cell bursting, is a cell eating itself from the inside out. That's metal. And that can also cause pus that can accumulate into an abscess. All right. Now, the skin, which is dominated by this epithelia and connective tissues, it regenerates rapidly and completely after injury. We'll talk about that when we talk about the integumentary system in chapter 5. Damage to the heart, though, is much more serious. Connective tissues of the heart can be repaired, but the majority of damaged cardiac muscles are replaced only by fibrous tissue. So the permanent replacement, that's called fibrosis. Fibrosis in muscle and other tissues may occur in response to injury, disease, or aging. All right. So all this stuff here, I think of a mirror, which is exposure, mast cell activation, inflammation, and regeneration. So your tissue is exposed to pathogens, toxins, all right? Those mast cells are activated, which cause inflammation, and they call in histamine, they call in heparin, which remember is that anticoagulant. Histamine was that vasodilator. So open up, let's bring in more stuff. Let's make sure things are flowing. We're gonna anticoagulate, and then we have prostaglandin, which I think just aids in that inflammatory response. Let's actually search for that. They increase capillary permeability. So we're going to open that vein, and then we're going to allow things to get through into the interstitial space. So it's going to allow things to pass through the blood vessels. So that's pretty cool. Then we have inflammation, which you can see is happening by redness, by heat, by swelling, by pain, sometimes by loss of function. When the inflammation stops, regeneration comes into play. And remember, those fibroblasts, those fiber builders, come in and they lay down a collagenous framework known as scar tissue. Over time, the scar tissue is remodeled and gradually has a more normal appearance. So think about the scars that you have if you have a serious cut or something. The mast cells then stop doing their thing with the histamines, all right? So inflammation, we have that increased blood flow, that vasodilation, which would occur because of histamines, the increased vessel permeability, which happens because of prostaglandin, abnormal conditions, we have pain, increased local temperature, which is going to go along with increased blood flow and permeability, that vessel dilation, obviously, so we can have more things coming through. Those phagocytes we were talking about, like macrophages, can start eating pathogens, and then things can come in and kind of clean up. What's that? This is a throwback from Bio 2, and we can think about, here's a pathogen like a splinter with some, I don't know, like bacteria on it, for example. So a pathogen comes in. We have two main responders at first, the mast cell and the macrophage. The macrophage eats a pathogen, and it's like, okay, this is no good. I need backup. So it releases this bat signal called cytokines, and that brings in Batman, I like to call the neutrophils. These are in the blood and can actually destroy pathogens. You can see them in the purple here. Meanwhile, we also have these mast cells, and these are immune cells found in connective tissue. These are these big red ones here. They're not in the blood. They're already in this connective tissue. And they release signaling molecules. So cytokines are one type of signaling molecule that are released by macrophages. Mast cells are going to release these signaling molecules, histamine. Yeah, which triggers the blood vessel to dilate and become more permeable. This allows Batman and the neutrophil to get through the blood vessel wall and come do its thing. It still uses that phagocytosis to come in and eat up the pathogens. So to recap, the macrophage calls Batman, neutrophil, and the mast cells with their histamines to come and do their thing. So that's pretty cool. All right, you can see the phagocytosis here by these neutrophils kind of cleaning things up. That's it. With advancing age, tissue regeneration decreases, cancer rates can increase, and that's that.